Hey there everybody, it's Mike DiLisio and welcome back to another batch of solo mode reviews. These are reviews of games that may or may not have already been covered in Dice Tower Studio reviews, but these are specifically focused on the solo mode experience for the games in question. I'm going to be doing 5 today and I'm just going to do them in alphabetical order. So why don't we get started with Águeda, City of Umbrellas. This is a game where you are placing umbrellas onto your board that replicate a street in the city of Águeda, and you are trying to make these umbrellas fit particular patterns for scoring and just basically maximize through drafting of these umbrella pieces the scoring you have compared to, in this case, an AI opponent. So, winning conditions, speaking of that, you really just need to score higher than what they call an AI, and I phrase it that way specifically on purpose. There is a somewhat of an opponent, doesn't really feel like an opponent, that is going to be taking particular umbrellas out of the display, and they're going to be scoring based upon how many of those umbrellas they take out. Fair enough. All right. So that's the winning condition. Let's talk about the rule book, the layout of that, and maybe the quality of it. The rules, the solo rules in this are in a separate section towards the end of the rule book. It's clear, simple, right? It's not a very difficult solo system. And they do a fine job of explaining the few differences that are involved when you're playing it solo versus when you're playing it multiplayer. The administration, how easy or difficult it is to run the solo mode in the game. This is a 1. This is really, there's nothing to it. Basically, what you're going to do is after you've taken your turn, you're drafting umbrellas, you're placing them on your board, scoring potentially for those umbrellas. Before you refill the market, you're going to flip over a card for the AI, and it's going to tell you to remove a particular type of umbrella. It might be the most, of 2 colors, red and blue, whichever one has the most, take all of those umbrellas and put them off to the side of the board, and then score a point for each umbrella that you have taken off. It's all going to be variations of that. And so it gives you a bit of agency in choosing what umbrellas you might take. Because if you choose to take maybe a single blue and you're leaving 5 reds in the display there, you know you're taking a risk because the next card could potentially be focusing on red. And then you're giving a lot of points to the AI opponent. So it's a very simple thing to administer. You flip the card, you do what it says. Nothing to it. So for final thoughts, I've already kind of alluded a little bit to my thoughts on the game. It's fine solo. It is one that I prefer multiplayer. And the biggest issue I have with the solo variant is that it doesn't really feel like an opponent you're playing against. It feels like really you're just trying to, as best as you can, score as high as you can without leaving a bunch of umbrellas of a particular or of any color. You don't want big groups of umbrellas on the display because they're always going to be taking some umbrellas off the display. The way that you score is that the difficulty level is you start the AI with a certain number of points. And so, the more difficulty, the lower number of points that you start them with. But they're going to basically score throughout the game for the umbrellas that are being taken off. And then at the end of the game, they're going to score an extra number of points based on the largest grouping. And so if you started them on 15 at the beginning of the game, and then they picked up maybe another 15 points throughout the game, that's 30. Then you'll look at their largest grouping. Let's say they had 7 of the red, which is the most, 37 points. And you're having to kind of go against that. It's fine. It's simple. It's light and breezy, but it doesn't really feel like an opponent, and so it's not terribly dynamic. I'm going to be giving it a 6 out of 10. Not bad, but just not something that I would go out of my way to recommend strictly as a solo game. All right, up next we have Ezra and Nehemiah. This is a heavy game from Garfield Games in their ancient civilizations line that have been with games like Hadrian's Wall before Raiders of Scythia. And Ezra Nehemiah is a game with a historical theme where you are going to be trying to gain the most points, not surprisingly. And in the solo mode, you are trying to face off against an AI opponent. The way that you are as a player getting points is varied. There are many different ways you can get points. There's some card play involved. There's a lot going on the board. And the AI is going to be competing in all of those areas through the use of cards, okay? So the winning condition is defeating the AI opponent. And you're going to be, again, focusing on a number of different areas that you are competing with that opponent. The rule book, the layout and quality is outstanding. This is 6 pages in the second half of the rule book, and the same attention and care, pictures, examples, detailed examples of the AI cards, detailed examples of how the solo actions differ from the actions in the standard game. So the solo AI opponent is going to do all the actions that the player does, but they're going to do them with some slight adjustments. And they do a great job of explaining those differences, those adjustments in the actions, and in discussing the cards, which Garfield, I believe from the very beginning, their AI cards have been called scheme cards, which I'm going to come out here and admit my ignorance as an American. I always thought that meant that the AI was playing scheme cards because they're sinister and they're fighting against you, because in the United States, scheme has a very kind of sinister connotation to it. Well, through interacting with people from other parts of the world, I found that scheme can mean plan. All right. And so these scheme cards are basically the plan cards for the AI. And in this particular game, you're actually going to be flipping over 2 cards. One is a focus card and the other is going to be the scheme card. So the focus kind of tells them where they're focusing at, where they're looking at as far as maybe different areas around the board. And then the scheme card is going to be telling you which actions they take and in which order. Okay. The rule book, very good. All right. The administration. So I'm giving this a 4 because there's a lot to account for in the running of this AI, and there's plenty to track. But the thing is that since you have so many things going on, so many potential interaction points, you really do need to have a system that accounts for all of those things. And so that just means that by nature, it's going to be a little bit harder to administer. I think they do as well as they can with this type of game, this heavy of a game, having a relatively clear and understandable AI opponent. The big thing is that there will be a learning curve because you have to kind of internalize the differences in the actions that the AI will take, and that's going to take you a couple of games. At least it took me a couple of games. So it's high on the administration scale there at 4, but I think it needs to be that way. All right, final thoughts. I've already kind of snuck in some of my final thoughts here, but I'll try to wrap it up in as neat a bow as I can. I think this is just an outstanding solo game. It really, really is. As I said earlier, it's a heavy Euro game with many, many interaction points, many areas that are going to kind of influence each other and things that have multiple kind of things to account for. And so the fact that they were able to pull off a robust solo mode that accounts for all of these things is an achievement in and of itself. And so with those things that you have to account for, I think they did it as elegantly as possible. Again, be prepared for a learning curve. But if you really want to get the feel of a heavy Euro game that you can play solo and you can really focus in on your turns and you don't have to worry about taking a long time because there's no one else at the table to account for, then I think this has a hugely rich experience to offer. It's an 8.5 for me overall because I think that Garphill does some of the best solo modes in the business, right? I mean, you've got the Stonemaier games are highly acclaimed for their solo modes and for good reason. But the Garphill games are going for even heavier games, I believe, and doing just a splendid job with a card-based system that doesn't put too many decision-making modes on the player. You just kind of have to follow, a structure, understand the differences in the actions, and you're good to go. All right. Coming up next is Fractured Sky from IV Studios. This is a game where you are trying to do a little bit of bluffing, all right? There's, area control to account for. It doesn't seem like the kind of game that should work as a solo game. It's a very, very interactive game that includes elements of bluffing. So how does this work in a solo game? We'll get there. The winning condition is that you have to defeat 2 AI opponents in the game. Actually, if you play the game as a 2-player game, just the standard game is a 2-player game, you have to add in one of these AI opponents. If you're playing it solo, you add in 2. All right, so there's always going to be at least 3 factions in play in a game of Fractured Sky. So you're trying to defeat both of the AI opponents. For the rule book, it's really good. The solo rules, just like I said with Ezra Nehemiah, I feel like the same amount of attention and care were placed on the solo rules as they were on the multiplayer rules. And I've got to tell you, that's not the norm. I wish it were the norm, but it's not the norm. So this had 10 pages of solo rules with lots of pictures, lots of examples. It did not feel like an afterthought thrown onto the end. This is something that a lot of time and effort went into, you can tell. For the administration, I'm saying a 3.5. The actual things that you're doing are not terribly complicated, but you do have 2 different AI opponents that you have to keep track of and administer to. And that's why I put it at slightly above a 3, although really what you're having to do for those AI opponents is not terribly complex. You do have some tiered processes for the AI, meaning things like it wants to go here. If it can't go here, then you have to do something else. Okay, and so that's what I mean by tiered processes, and that's unavoidable a lot of times in games where you are moving units and there's an area control element to the game. But that's why I put it at a 3.5. It is not terribly complex, but there are some things you need to kind of go through a list of things to do, and you have 2 AI opponents to do that for. Okay, for our final thoughts here, it's very impressive, honestly, that they were able to pull off a solo variant, a solo mode for a game with these mechanisms. It does not feel like a game that should work for solo, and it does. In my opinion, it works very well. I'm actually going to be giving this an 8. So what they're going to be doing, the way they kind of pull this off is that the whole idea about bluffing, I think, is that you are giving some limited information to the other players based on where you place, but the way this works is that you are placing things out face down, so you don't know the value exactly. And so you might be bluffing someone into playing a low-valued chip into an area that they think you're really going for, and maybe it'll draw them over there. There's a similar thing that goes on, whereas with the AIs, you're going to flip 3 numbers face up, and you know that those aren't going to be in the mix. So it gives you a limited amount of information, and then they're going to be placing them in the other places. So you have to account for where the AI is and what they may have there. You have some limited information. Does it perfectly replicate the idea of bluffing? No. But does it work? Yes. So I'm giving it an 8. I really do enjoy the solo mode for Fractured Sky. Next up, let's go to Japan. This is a game where the winning condition is defeating an AI travel agent, which I think is pretty hilarious based on the theme of this game. The rule book is, it's barely there. It's half of the back page of the rule book. Why is that? Well, because honestly, the game as a multiplayer game is very much feels in a lot of ways like a multiplayer solitaire game. Now, I know some people take that as a pejorative term. I don't happen to. Really, the interaction you have is by passing cards, and that stays here. You keep that here. You're passing cards to an AI opponent, okay? And so you have some idea of what you're giving them. You're not going to necessarily remember everything that you give them, but it'll work. It works. The administration is a 2. It's very simple. Basically, you have to make sure that the cards are going in correct places. Other than that, there's not much you have to do, quote unquote, for the AI. You're just going to be giving them some cards, and certain things that you are not taking are going to be useful for them in the end game. It's a good way to learn the multiplayer game, I think. It does feel similar to that multiplayer game, as I said. It's very light and breezy. It's not a heavy game at all. But if you want just a relaxing solo game with a beautiful aesthetic that's very simple to administer and run, this might be up your alley, especially if you like this theme of traveling through Japan. I'm giving it a 7.5. I do recommend it. Just know that it's very light, and if that's what you're looking for, I think it will deliver. Finally, we're going to be covering Nova Roma. Nova Roma is a game where you are playing, it's based in the Roman era, not a particularly unique theme. It's a Euro game, and it has kind of almost a Trajan feel, if you are familiar with that game, where there are different areas around the board where you're going to be scoring points. And it does so with a very, very innovative and unique action selection system, okay? So you have to defeat an AI opponent in Nova Roma. That's the winning condition. You are going to be competing in all of the different areas in a slightly simplified, but still, in my opinion, satisfying way. The rule book, it's good. It's, I believe, 3 pages or so, plenty of examples, pictures, clearly laid out. I was able to learn just with the rule book, no problem at all. It's actually quite a simple solo mode for the game, and I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. The administration, from 1 to 5, 1 being easy, 5 being difficult, it's a 2. It is surprisingly easy to run the solo for a game this weight. I'm really impressed by that. Basically what you're doing is you're flipping over the administrator tile like you normally do to kind of see where the administrator goes, and then you're placing out these legionnaires, which after you take your turn, they basically are going to be adding onto that central action mechanism board, or action selection mechanism in the middle of the board. And so it allows you to still get what is satisfying and unique about the action selection system, because basically what you're going to be doing is you're going to be placing in rows or columns that are going to determine the strength of the action that is in the row or column, and the strength of it can be determined by the number of pieces in that row or column. And so when you go later in the round, you're typically going to be able to get stronger actions because there'll be more pieces out there in that area. And so that keeps that there with these legionnaire pieces that you place out. And so I'm really impressed with, again, how little you have to account for the AI opponent in just terms of the mechanics of it. Final thoughts. This is a game where in a mid-weight, definitely mid-weight Euro game, lets you administer it very simply and then gets out of the way, okay? Basically, the way they're going to score points is going to be based upon what you prioritize and do. Okay, so when you choose not to do something, that almost always is going to lead to points for the AI in that thing. Okay, so you have tracks that you are kind of competing for, and they're going to start ahead of you on these tracks. And you're like, okay, well, if I don't focus on these tracks, they're going to beat me in scoring here. But maybe it's worth it for me to do that because I'm really going to focus on this area here. I'm going to make sure that I'm crushing the AI in this area, maybe focus on a couple of areas. Just by the nature of the game, you're going to have to be doing something in all of the different areas of the board. But, I like the idea that it puts down little things that help you kind of continue to play the game as it's normally played, but then really gets out of its way. You can focus on what you want to focus on, knowing though that you have to account for the things you're not doing because they're going to be the things that really help the AI opponent. I think this is just a terrific solo game. I'm giving it a 9 because you look at it and it looks so almost intimidating. It's a big Euro game with lots of stuff going on, and the solo game keeps that feel, but it lets you do it without having to really spend much of any of your brain power on what the solo does, right? It gets out of the way. You're able to really focus on what you want to do. You're not having to administer a bunch of things where you're moving pieces here and there and having to kind of change the way things work. It really is just like the game, but lets you really focus in on your turn, which in a Euro game I think is great. An efficiency type of Euro game, what you really want to be able to do in the solo version is focus on what you want to do. And the solo mode gets out of the way. That really is a shining example of that here in Nova Roma. So a 9 again for that. All right, there you go. 5 solo modes. Most of them I thought were at least good, if not exceedingly good, and one that didn't quite hit the mark, but not terrible. All right, there you go. That's going to do it for me. This is Mike DiLisio signing off from the Dice Tower Midwest Annex.
Hey folks, thanks for watching another one of our videos. If you like our videos, if you like our channel, you would love to game with us at one of our conventions. Check out Dice Tower Cruise, Dice Tower East, and Dice Tower West. Fantastic conventions where we play games with wonderful people, a humongous library, and lots of other events and stuff. Also, don't forget to check out our channel, like and subscribe. I'm Tom Bassel.